You'll often hear people say, choose a lens, stick with it until you get to know it. And I think that's sage advice, but I think the advice is kind of somewhat missing there. What does it mean until you know it inside out? What does it mean to understand and to know your lens? Well, in this video here, I'm going to look at that and exactly what it means, what it is you should be looking to learn about your lens in order to fully understand it, because it's more than just grasping the focal length. So the focal length is kind of a useful tool, but at the same time, it's not everything. So what I've got here is an array of lenses. I've got my main camera here, which is my 5DSR with my Cambo and my 90mm Mamiya Secor C lens. This is my main lens. This is the lens I use for almost everything. I've then got, let's organise them a bit better, my Mamiya 50mm lens, which is the second most used lens I have. My Mamiya 127 lens, which is probably going to get sold because I actually don't use it as much as I thought I would, but it's a beautiful bit of kit there. I then have my Zeiss Milvers macro planar, which is a beast of a lens, but it doesn't fit on this, but it does fit on the Canon, so that's good. So I use this a lot for commercial work. And I've then got some of my more behind the scenes utilitarian lenses. So this is my Sigma 35mm lens, which I bought the day it came out, and this had a hard life. So I used to work as a documentary photographer, working with musicians, bands and that sort of thing, and this was my go-to. Beautiful bit of kit for that sort of thing. Not so much for food work and still life. And then I've got my 24-70, the trusty lens, which just does everything you need it to do. And I'm going to talk about these and how I get to know my lenses and what I do with them. So let's start at this end here, because this is the least useful, and we'll move over to the most useful. Now, when it comes to my 24-70mm lens, I've had this for a long time and I don't particularly like it. I never have done. I don't know this lens particularly well. I use it as a get the job done lens. This is my, I've got to go and do something. Recently I did some work for a local film production company. They needed someone on set for 3 days just to take the stills for the posters for the films they're making for these American clients. So I took this knowing that it would cover everything, bang it at f8, it'll be fine. It's a bit soft and gooey around the edges, but I will be able to get the shot within the 30-second time frame I have and be able to get wide, standard and slightly tele. That's all good. Now I obviously have other lenses as well. I've got the full gamut of zoom lenses, and I treat all of them like this. I don't get to know them that well because I don't need to. They're just get the job done utilitarian workhorses. They're not for creative decision making. This 35mm lens though, I did get to know this lens well. And the reason is simply because this here lived on a 5D Mark II for a good 8 years whilst I worked as documentary work for musicians, going on tour, like concerts and all the rest of it. This is a 35 1.4, and I learnt a lot about this lens. And the first thing I learnt is Canon cameras like Sigma lenses because these offer a very cool color rendering with a slight purple tint to it, which works really well on Canon's very red sensor. So that was good. I learnt that f1.4 is super soft, but it's fine at high ISO because it's so soft, and the ISO makes the image so soft you don't notice. But at low ISO, you need to be at f1.8. And I also know that after f4, it doesn't get any sharper at the edges. And these things are kind of useful and kind of interesting. I also know that if you're going to shoot into the light source, it can't focus. You have to manually override the focus. And knowing that before having the problem is key, because you sit there with your camera, you flick the button and you move that and you flick it back again. It's just like one swift, easy movement, and you know what's coming. And especially when you're doing documentary work, you don't have time to faff around going, oh, the focus is hunting backwards and forwards. You just flick the switch in your hand, move it like that with the focus, and then flick it back again when you're finished. Really useful bit of kit. I don't really use it much anymore. It's sometimes used for the time lapses we do here in the studio. I'll often have it at f1.8, focus on the camera in the center of the studio and just run a time lapse for the day. I should sell it probably, but I'm kind of emotionally attached to it. This has been some really cool parties with me. It has seen some things that I could never repeat to you backstage at festivals with some very big bands. So I'll probably keep this one until I die. Now moving on to the Zeiss Milvers. This has got the wrong lens thing. Let's flip these around. There we go. This is my go-to commercial photography lens when I'm not using my Cambo. I like 100mm because I like the compression. I like that focal length. I don't own a 50 anymore. I sold it because I didn't use it. I only use 100. So this is my only lens I have for my food work if I'm not using this. Obviously, if we're shooting some huge, massive flat lay, I might rent a 50mm lens or the 55 Otus, but this here is my workhorse. This comes with me when we're shooting stuff where we don't have time to use a big field camera. Now this lens here has a particular coating on it. There are two versions. There's the previous version, the old one, and this one. This one's super expensive. I think it was like £1,900. The previous one I could have got secondhand for 800, but the coating on this, which is the only difference, is very important. And it is much underrated compared to people who talk about DxO scores. Go, oh, DxO score says it's as sharp or slightly less sharp than the previous one. It's like, well, that's great, but the coating on the elements here allows you to control the highlights better. So if, like me, you shoot with a lot of hard specular light, you get a lot of highlights, and controlling them is very difficult, and this here just reins them in that little bit. The contrast on it is brilliant. It's not too contrasty, which is a nightmare for then post-production, but it's not so flat that you end up having to just like do obscene things with the curve. It is incredibly sharp and detailed from f2.8 onwards, and it continues to be sharp until about f11 before you start to get diffraction. That's important for me to know. The edge-to-edge sharpness is incredibly good at 5.6, which is important for me to know because I often fill the frame. So I know if I fill the frame, I hit it at f10, on 100mm there'll be no distortion, no pin cushioning, and it'll be sharp all the way around the edges. So that's good to know. Obviously, a bit expensive. I would advise, unless you absolutely need those things I've talked about, get the Canon L version secondhand. It's like 500 quid. It'll be 90% as good, 98% as good. Hardly noticeable online. But anyway, I've got this one. This will last me my lifetime. It's manual focus, so there's not much to go wrong with it. Although I say that, it has been in for a repair and the repair did cost me £900. So a bit salty about that. Okay, now we move on to my main lenses. These are my Mamiya Secors. Now this one here is the 127. I don't know this lens very well yet because I haven't had the chance to use it that much, but I can tell you what I do know about it. First of all, it's incredibly soft until you get to f11. f11 and below, too soft to use, absolutely. But that's cool because I'm often at f16 and you can go to f22 with no diffraction. I think it's because it's such a big lens and it's designed to do a 6x7cm negative, and I'm only using 35mm of it. I'm only getting the very center of it and the very sharpest part of it. Now, I think that this might not be the right lens for me because I would like to be able to shoot at f8 and still get a sharp image at 5.6. Obviously at 3.8, which is wide open on these lenses, you can't expect too much. This is probably made in the 1970s, 60s, it's pretty old. But still, it does have a very nice rendering. And when I say rendering or drawing of an image, what I'm talking about is the way that it takes that image and transfers it to the sensor, the way that it projects it onto the sensor, because all of these do it in a different way. Now this lens here is the first lens I bought for this camera. This is the 50mm. And the reason I bought a 50mm first was because I just sold my 50 and I thought, well, do you know what, we might as well get another one just to be safe. And this lens here is like a razor blade. It is so sharp. This is an f4.5 to f32 lens. From about f8 onwards, it is as sharp as you like. And on a 35mm sensor, I get corner to corner sharpness. Now, obviously when you go wide open, not so good, but I don't go wide open, so that's not a problem for me. The contrast is brilliant. It very rarely flares. No matter how much backlight you throw into this for such a wide lens, you just don't get lens flare. And again, that could be to do with the size of the image it's projecting onto the sensor, but still, very useful for me because we backlight a lot of stuff. The colors from this lens are very consistent to the colors on the 90mm lens, and that's good as well because sometimes we might be shooting a story or a series which works as a story, and I want the images to really look like they're part of the same thing. And yes, you can correct the colors so they look pretty much the same, but it's not the same. It's not the same thing, so that's useful. Now, this 50mm lens also works as a brilliant macro on this bellows system, and a lot of my macro work, shots of individual coffee beans, they're shot on this 50mm lens, and you can literally get it to about this distance and it'll still focus beautifully. Now that brings us through to my main lens, my 90mm, which is my technical camera's equivalent to the 100mm. It's so similar you can barely tell the difference in that sense. I would say it captures more detail at f10 than the Zeiss Milvers. Now this is the standard lens. The 90mm on a Mamiya RZ67 is the equivalent of a 50mm on a normal camera. Now although this is a 90mm here, it doesn't make it a 50mm on this because it's all relative to the sensor size, but it makes it a 90mm. It's a good bit of kit. We are often between f11 and f22. At f22 we don't get any weird artifacts, we don't get any ridiculous chromatic aberrations. At f32 the image falls to pieces. Below that it's a bit soft, and as you'll see, because what I've just done is actually part of the testing for fall off of focus, and I'm going to show you that at the end. But at f3.5, 5.6 is a bit too soft for my liking, but that might be a benefit to you. If you're a portrait photographer, 3.5 and this might be beautiful. That might be exactly what you want. But that's not what I'm after, and that's important to know. The contrast, the colours are very good. You know, there's no vignetting because it's such a large projection of light onto the sensor. We're not even getting close to the vignetting. And even when we go for these obscene movements on the camera like this, it still doesn't vignette. It's a 6x7 image circle. So that's really important to me. Now, the other thing to look at is the way that the sharpness falls off and how that corrects itself throughout the aperture range. I'm going to show you how to test your lens. So using this camera here, we've got the aperture set to 3.5, which is wide open. And I've got a very textured board down here. It's got like paint texture on it. And all I'm going to do is focus about here. This does not have to be an exact science. This is just for a bit of funsies. And we just take a frame. And all we're going to do now is work our way through the apertures. And we'll just keep taking frames all the way through like this. And we're just focused here on a very thin strip. And I'm going to take these into Photoshop later and show you what I do with them. And it's just to look at how the sharpness in the center of the frame is compared to at the edges. And that's a good test to do on all your imaging lenses. Because if you're doing a flat lay and you want stuff in the corners to be sharp, you need to know what aperture you want to be at. If you're a wedding photographer and you've banged your 35mm lens on to get the group shot, you need to know if at 5.6 you're in focus at the left-hand side as much as you are in the center, because you don't want those poor people at the edges to be like blurry, distorted messes. So that's an important test to do. Another test I think is important for some of you, depending on your style of work, is to have your camera set up here, pop an item to photograph, pop one a bit further back out of focus and a bit further back, focus here and just see what the fall off of focus looks like. The outer focus on the Zeiss Milvers is beautiful if you're into that sort of stuff. The outer focus on this 35mm 1.4 is beautiful until you get to f2.2. The outer focus on these Mamiya Sequel lenses is lovely until you get to f8. But knowing these things is important. It's really important to have a good firm grasp on what works, what doesn't work, and then how to utilize those lenses. And I do believe in the whole theory of just have one lens until you've mastered it, but I don't think people fully understand that statement. It's not have one lens until you've learned to compose at 50mm for a year. Yes, that's important. But what's more important is to understand how to work the lens, when to work the lens, what it's good for, what it's bad at. You know, sometimes we will be shooting all day on this lens here and we'll go, do you know what, we need to get a slightly dreamy shot. This is not the lens. We'll move back to not having the technical camera. We'll just grab a standard Canon and we'll bang the Zeiss Milvers on it, because that's going to give us a better look for what we're after there. Or perhaps we want those beautiful flat lays with edge-to-edge sharpness, you know, and we go, right, we're going to need some 3200 watt lights coming in because we're going to need to be at this aperture, and whatever it may be. Very important stuff, very much underrated, and I also think quite misunderstood as well. Anyway, I'm blathering on. Right, I'm going to drag a CRT file, here it goes, straight in, and I'm going to show you how you kind of map the focus of the lens. So we do that, we go to filter, stylize, and it's find edges, there we go. So here we go, so this is my lens wide open, and what we can see here is a pretty even focus. Slightly off at the right, but it turns out I had my swing at the back of the camera slightly off kilter. So that'd be that. But there's one image. What I'm going to do now is bring in some sort of I think this is wide open. Pop this one down. Let's go to OK. And obviously this is kind of what I want to see in my lens. You might want fall off at the sides. You might find that a nice, so this again, stylized, find edges, a nice aesthetic. But I like this solid line of focus through the center to be as even as possible. And obviously when it's more central, this bit here does come up a bit more, but I got it swung, so I've got a bit of the edge of the lens. Now, if I was shooting this on the Mamiya 6.7 that it's designed for, I think I'd have some very different results. Let's pull out a very well stopped down one. Here we go. Let's just bump the exposure a bit here because I think I ran out of ISO. So this is when I've really stopped the lens down to get a bit more sharpness going. There's like f11, f16.
Yeah, so it's pretty evenly focused, but it's much easier to see it on these here. And this is what you're looking at. This band here, you'll find some where it's like all in the center and nothing at the edge. You'll find some weird artifacts and sometimes you'll notice your lens is damaged. If you find that one side just randomly focuses up here, you've probably knocked an element out of place. So it's worth knowing these things. It's worth having a little play with this sort of thing just to see how your lens is performing. But yeah, I just thought this would be a bit of interesting. And now I think I got this particular method from Ted Forbes. I don't think his channel's called Ted Forbes anymore. I think it's called something else, and it will come to me. The Art of Photography. There we go. He did a video on this, and this is what got me onto it. And this is his method, and apparently he got it from some bigwig who really knows what they're doing, whereas I'm just a mere mortal. But anyway, I thought I'd quickly show you that.
If you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments below. Do hit like and subscribe. It really helps me out. If you have any questions or would you like some particular videos making, let me know in the comments below, because I do read all of them, even if I don't respond to all of them. And I'll do my best at pulling something out for you. I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.